Okay, Marina, we're now live.
Great, thanks a lot, Gary. Well, welcome everybody to this webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm sure you're joining from across the world. It's a great pleasure to be convening this event, which is part of the Participation Research Week series that launches the SAGE Handbook of Participatory Research and Inquiry. My name is Marina Apka, and I'm part of the Participation, Inclusion and Social Change Research Cluster at IDS. And today our webinar is co-hosted with the Center for Development Impact because we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into the handbook section that focuses on participatory methods that are used in the monitoring, evaluation and learning space. And I've had the great privilege to co-edit this section with my friend and dear colleague, Will Allen. Will, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Marina. Yeah, I was a section editor with Marina on this. I'm an independent researcher and consultant based in Christchurch in New Zealand. Most of my work's around supporting collaboration and multi-stakeholder processes. And I also run the Learning for Sustainability website.
Great, and thank you so much for getting up very early or staying up very late in New Zealand.
Yeah, 1 a.m.
So we're also joined today by one of the contributing authors, Rebecca Serro. Rebecca, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Serro. I am an associate professor and evaluation specialist at Washington State University, which means I'm located on the west coast of the United States. So it's early for me, and I'm pleased to be here this morning. My job is focused in the area of extension, which is the link between the general public in the United States and our university system. So I'm particularly tasked with ensuring the programs that we provide to the residents of our state are meeting their needs. And I'm excited to be here and talk about a participatory technique that I use quite frequently called ripple effects mapping.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Rebecca, for being with us. And we also have invited Tom Aston to offer some reflections of how this contribution fits into the broader evaluation landscape. So Tom, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Tom Aston, an independent monitoring, evaluation and learning consultant. Most of my background is working with NGOs, but also with government as well on certain things. My main area is around theory-based evaluation and how that blends with more participatory evaluation.
Brilliant, thanks so much for being with us, Tom. So that's who we are, and we'll be hearing more from everybody in a minute. But we also wanted to hear a bit more from all of you, or to know at least who you are. So we're going to do a quick Mentimeter exercise. So hopefully you've all done this before. What you need to do is go to menti.com. Or you can scan the QR code that's showing right now on the screen using your device. And when you get to menti.com, you need to put the code which is showing on the screen into the website. So I'll put that in the chat as well while people are getting ready. 602-93264. So we'll go over to Menti now. There are two questions. The first one, which I should be presenting live in a minute, is asking you where you're zooming in from. So, as we can see the dots coming in, we've got quite a big European crowd, which is not surprising given the time of day. Some North American colleagues, which is great. We know we've got at least one in Australasia, Will, but most others are probably asleep. Some from South America, Asia, Africa. Great. Thanks everybody for joining in, all your different time zones. And good to know that this is of interest across the world. And then the second question you've all answered is, what is your primary role? Because we know that when we're working with methodologies in the evaluation space, We can be researchers. At the same time, we're evaluators, and we may be doing that from within an NGO, or we may be more interested in how the evidence is then used to inform policy or government. Interesting, there's quite a few other. So some of you don't neatly fit into one of the boxes, which is often the case with those of us in these hybrid spaces. But we've got a good representation, it would seem, from the NGO and charity sector with us. Great. Well, thank you all for taking a few minutes to share your thoughts with us. So we'll move on now to just introduce very briefly, hopefully you're seeing my screen again, managing the technology, to just a few words to situate today's conversation. So we find ourselves in a really exciting moment, and this is why Will and I undertook this project, in terms of where the long-standing debates around participatory methods are now finding themselves in the evaluation sector, which of course is always evolving. And there are two major trends that we feel opens up a really interesting space for deepening this conversation about participatory practice. On the one hand, we see that evaluation community is increasingly accepting and grappling with complexity as programs and interventions work across sectors, themes, and scales, and as we acknowledge uncertainty and how change happens. So major evaluation conferences, for example, the European Evaluation Society conference a couple of weeks ago, are now focusing entirely on ways to work with rather than reduce complexity. So as Tom was saying before, he works in how do you bring together theory-based and participatory methods. That's often where the discussion is. On the other hand, there's a growing conversation about how evaluation serves transformative change agendas, how it can be an empowering, emancipatory practice rather than simply serving the narrow interests of commissioners. So it's the combination of these two trends that situates evaluation today as a practice that aims to understand plural, contested, and uncertain pathways to change. So participatory approaches that explicitly open up space to do this and center the lived experience of change are no longer niche practices of a few diehard participatory methodologists, but are now becoming part of every evaluator's methodological repertoire. So our hope is that this section in the SAGE handbook, this publication, makes a small contribution into this evolving field. And of course, it remains perhaps even more important to focus our conversations on the quality of participatory processes. So Will and I had the really wonderful opportunity to work with 18 contributing authors in the 6 methods chapters in the section, which you can see here, that offer critical reflection on the participatory potential of well-known methods, such as outcome mapping, most significant change, as well as newer promising methods, which we'll hear more about from Rebecca, such as ripple effects mapping. And some of the other contributing authors, I think, may also be on the call today. So if you are, please do join in with your thoughts. So from me, really just a huge thank you to everybody who was part of this project. As Will said, it's taken a few years. And for sharing not just methods and not just the practice, but also your own experiences and your own insights. So, Will, I'll hand over to you now to talk us through a bit more of the framing that we used in the section.
Yeah, that's fine. You've got another slide there, haven't you?
Yep.
So, yeah, thanks for filling out the Mentimeter before, and it's really good to see the range of geographies and jobs that people are coming with. So you're all here with different hats and different evaluation programs behind you. And given the specifics of any particular evaluation are very unique to its own context and aims, I'm just going to quickly acknowledge 3 of the very broad framings that Marina and I used in our overview chapter. And it's just something for you to keep in mind as our panelists talk. So a simple logic model approach to program planning and evaluation, which is here, the different audiences we might include and the different roles that those of us who are evaluators might find ourselves in. So this slide, just to start, it's a simple program logic model. Programs begin with thinking about a problem and setting an aim. We invest resources to fund activities and produce goods and services. And we always hope these change the world beyond our program and contribute positively towards some desired outcomes. But equally, we can see different types of evaluation can be mapped to all of these different phases of a program, from assessing needs, ensuring accountability against both what we invest and the goods and services we produce. Formative and process evaluations can look at the quality of our activities with the different parties that we work with. And there's an emphasis on assessing performance of outputs and outcomes. So do you want to go on to the next slide? So that's just one framing, remembering that there are so many types of evaluation we can use for different parts of programs. Similarly, it's really easy to say it's a participatory event or it's a participatory program, and it can almost sound as though participation means every voice is heard equally. But in reality, all forms of participation are necessarily selective. So one of the key issues in participatory evaluation is to consider really carefully whose voices to include, how to include them, and so to determine who speaks for who. But across the typology of evaluations, there's always a range of potential stakeholders who should be considered as participants. And at a minimum, we would suggest these four crop up quite often. You've got your funders, agencies or commissioners, people that actually put up the job that evaluators are doing. And it's a choice about which they can contribute to and we can contribute to about how much they get involved. Program staff are there all the time, and hopefully evaluation is there from the start, and they're using that to adjust the program. Quite often it's, in this complex day and age, program staff are working through intermediaries and partners, NGOs, so they should have a say in what's going on. And then obviously there's a lot of key groups and peoples that are impacted, hopefully positively, but nonetheless, the program makes a difference to their lives. So when we're talking about participation, it's often quite important to talk about which of these groups or which other groups we're talking about. We're not just necessarily, it's not always the end user of the program or the key groups that are impacted. And we've got one more slide there. All of the authors contributed because participation and evaluation is not really just about methods, it's almost about the evaluators themselves. So people contributed and said, well, what makes this method work is our principles and guiding ideas, or our facilitation skills, the fact that we've got the skills to engage with people, we've got the cultural safety skills, we can manage group processes. Humility and honesty, because particularly if evaluators aren't the external judges, then we're actually listening to a lot of different groups and finding out from them what they see as success, what they see as failure. Reflexivity, how we actually work as evaluators and think about change, and how we can work with people that are in a monitoring, evaluation and learning framework and give them the spaces to reflect and adapt their practices. And, it's being pragmatic and understanding a political context. We don't always work in ideal situations, and it's trying to do the best we can and just move every program on. So those were some of the things that people talked about as being important in participatory monitoring and evaluation and learning. And back to you, Marina.
Great, thanks so much, Will. So that sort of sets the scene a little bit for what we want to dig into today. So we're going to hear from Rebecca, who's going to talk about ripple effects mapping, one of the methods that's in the chapter that she led on. And then we're going to ask Tom to reflect a bit on how this all sits in the broader evaluation community. So before I hand over to Rebecca, just to say that please do share questions that come up for any of the speakers, or broader reflections, or indeed your own experiences in the chat. So I'll monitor that and we can come back to those at the end. So Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you, Marina. Hello, everyone, again. I was the first author on a chapter titled Ripple Effects Mapping, a participatory strategy to measuring program impact. You can see my fellow co-authors there. I'm not sure that any of them are on today, but they were all obviously very important aspects to getting this chapter finished. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how ripple effects mapping is participatory and both sort of the assets and challenges of engaging in a participatory strategy. Let's go ahead and get started. So I just wanted to give kind of a brief overview of ripple effects mapping, or REM. You'll frequently see it referred to as, in case you're not familiar with it. I do have some sources to share at the end, in case you're interested in looking more into ripple effects mapping. But in the meantime, just a brief overview. So it's a participatory tool that collects qualitative and storytelling, that has a qualitative and storytelling focus type of data. It's designed to evaluate community groups, coalitions, and other similar types of organizations. So for the most part, it's designed to really work with complex groups on complex types of projects and programs. So if you have something simple, this is probably not necessarily going to get at what you need. It uses a variety of techniques to gather that impact, and it involves a variety of different aspects. And I just quickly wanted to mention what those aspects are before I talk a little more detail. So during ripple effects mapping, you're using things like appreciative inquiry, mind mapping tactics, facilitated discussion, group reflection, qualitative data analysis. So all of those kind of combine together to create this set of information that's useful when it comes to understanding the impact that a group, program, or project might have had. So what are some assets of using this? First, it creates a visual representation of efforts and impact. Regardless if you happen to be doing ripple effects mapping in person, or if it's during, say, a global pandemic and you can't get together in person, then you're able to do things online. And so there is a way that we've created a system to gather this information. And so your map might be a handwritten map, or it might be an online map, but regardless, it does create this overall idea of what has the group accomplished in a visual way. And I'll show you in a little bit what I mean by that. It gives voice to a diversity of stakeholders. This is sort of, I will continuously, obviously, focus on the ways in which ripple effects mapping is participatory, and this is one of those ways. So stakeholders play a major role in ripple effects mapping throughout the continuum of the ripple effects mapping session. So they start and they help with planning, they participate heavily during, and they also are engaged in the analysis portion. And we're able to include both program participants as well as those who have different program roles, or even people who are not directly involved in the group or in the organization or coalition or whoever it is that you may be mapping. It also captures the session's participants' firsthand experiences. And again, very participatory, with encouraging those who are engaged in the room, whether that's a virtual room or an in-person room, to talk directly about how they have been impacted by this program, or how their families have been, how their organizations have been, how their communities have been impacted. And overall, what it does is identify the activities that have developed or rippled out from a program or process. So if you think about the concept of dropping a pebble in a pond and how the ripples come out from that pebble, that's what we're looking to understand. So the program's group, that group work, that program, that coalition, whatever it is, that's the pebble that drops into the pond. And what we're looking to understand is what has come about, what has rippled out as a result of that pebble dropping into the community. So these ripples can either be intended or unintended outcomes. Oftentimes when we're collecting evaluation data, we're very specifically looking for specific outcomes. What's very participatory and useful about ripple effects mapping is that it doesn't necessarily go in knowing all the answers or knowing exactly how people are going to respond. Instead, it really encourages people to speak to what their experiences are, and as a result, there's often unintended things that come out that many times either the evaluator wasn't expecting or the program leaders or stakeholders weren't expecting either. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about what are the components of ripple effects mapping. So it uses appreciative inquiry. I mentioned that before. And what appreciative inquiry does in this sense is it's a concept of using positively framed questions to guide the small group interview process that's part of the data collection. And what we're able to do through using appreciative inquiry is that we find that generative knowledge is created. And what generative knowledge allows you to do is bring about this transformative, emergent type of change that is very beneficial to organizations. And so we use very open-ended appreciative inquiry questions, and it allows those intended and unintended outcomes to come through in a way that if you were using something more specific, like a focus group question, you wouldn't necessarily get to. It also, as I mentioned, obviously takes a participatory approach. That's why we're all here today talking about this. And so, as I said before, it's designed to engage stakeholders during each step of the process. We are very intentional to engage with stakeholders to ensure that the design of the ripple effects mapping session, meaning things like who's going to be in the room, who's invited to share, who will be asked afterwards to share, what types of questions should we be using? All of those things there's engagement with the stakeholders, program leaders, and others to talk through what the ripple effects mapping session should look like and who should be engaged in it. There's also part, obviously, during the actual collection, although many of you probably haven't actually seen a ripple effects mapping session. I'm going to share a link for you to go and check one out later if you'd like. During the actual collection, it's the participants' voices that are highlighted. The participants drive the sharing of the information. And then during the collection, during the data collection portion, we have the opportunity for participants to do more group reflection. And that allows people to kind of engage with each other to highlight and better understand the direction in which the group has come and the direction in which it may want to go. And then during the analysis part of the analysis portion of the ripple effects mapping, we also engage with stakeholders to ensure that the coding and the themes that are coming out are an accurate reflection of what's happening within the group. And so involving people in each aspect of that continuum is a very important piece. A lot of times when you look at participatory evaluation, people sort of say, well, I'm asking participants to tell their story and therefore it's participatory. And that necessarily isn't true because that's a very narrow version of participatory. It's important to kind of think about each aspect of the evaluation and ensure that you're engaging with stakeholders throughout the whole thing. The last two components of ripple effects mapping is that it involves an interactive group interviewing and reflective process. So this process generates ideas in a collective kind of manner, and it provides an opportunity to figure out how program effects are interconnected. If you have someone do an evaluation where they're filling out a survey individually, or they're doing a key informant interview individually, there is no aspect of being able to kind of reflect on what others are saying and understanding what others have found to be useful or helpful. And what ripple effects mapping does is because it involves kind of a group interview first, there's a couple people that get together and talk to each other, and then it involves that group option of sort of talking through on a group level and mapping things out. It really gives people the opportunity to understand their individual piece as well as kind of the collective. So if you think about the analogy of kind of eating the elephant, right? People sort of talk about their own little portion of the elephant. Ripple effects mapping allows the group to step back and sort of see the elephant as a whole. There's also this reflection portion that we've built in, and reflection encourages accountability. Oftentimes when we're doing qualitative data analysis, one of the important pieces is to do a member check to ensure that there isn't kind of groupthink going on. And what ripple effects mapping does during the reflection portion is give people the opportunity to sort of check to make sure that the information being shared is truly accurate and reflective. of what is actually happening. And then lastly, it utilizes a radiant thinking or mind mapping, which is what is often referred to. Radiant thinking is when there's sort of this idea that you have associative thoughts that originate from a central point, and then they link together to kind of form what these integrated concepts are. So during the group process, and again, whether I'm going to show you in just a minute what this kind of looks like, but in a group process, whether it's online or in person, you kind of start with the central idea of why we're here, what's happening with the coalition or the group or the program. And then you have people diagram out through their voice, talk through what it is that they have found to be impactful or affecting or whatever it may be. They talk through that, and those program efforts become a visual map that sort of shows what the events and outcomes have come about as a result of the work. And so it's really kind of a hierarchical scheme that develops organically in the group. And so really what that tells us is that it's so participatory that you could get 10 members of a group together and 10 different members, and their maps may look very different from each other. And that's okay, and that makes sense. Because what this does is really give people the opportunity to think through, both on their individual as well as on a group level, what has happened as a result of the work. So these are the actual process steps for ripple effects mapping. I've talked about it in the very abstract, and this is more specific. So prior to the ripple effects mapping event, we identify what the intervention might be. And I mentioned before this idea of complexity. We have found that for ripple effects mapping, complexity is very important. It works best with those programs or projects that have been going on for a long time, that involve many moving parts. And especially those that are producing significant change, because then what you find is that as a result of the appreciative inquiry questions that are asked during that group interviewing, the intervention and the outcomes from it become quite varied, and people tell many different stories as opposed to just a couple. If something very small is happening, everyone's kind of going to be focused on the same thing. The complex work is when you get a very interesting and varied map. Also prior to the actual ripple effects mapping is this idea of scheduling and inviting. And I mentioned before how this is a very participatory piece of ripple effects mapping. You ensure that as evaluators, we ensure that those we're working with, the stakeholders, are engaged with when the schedule happens, who's invited, the types of questions that are engaged in, and things like that. During the actual session, you conduct appreciative inquiry. People conduct appreciative inquiry interviews with each other. And what this does is allow those it allows the questions to be both open-ended, but also not affected by interviewer effect, because everyone's asking the same questions of each other. So it's not like we put people in small groups and say, just talk amongst yourselves about this group or about this project. Instead, we have very specific questions that they ask each other. And then at that point is when we get people back together, and that group process of driving the story forward, of mapping out the ripples, looking at the reflection, that's when this happens. And then at the end of, once the session has concluded, this is sort of the post ripple effects mapping part, is when you clean, code, and analyze. And again, this is also very participatory and important. So this is just a very general map. I intentionally made it a little bit fuzzy because I didn't want to share necessarily the specific details of what were shared, but this was an online map that was created by a coalition. And so you can see sort of the spokes coming out from that central concept that I talked about. So each of these spokes was an individual that shared their story. And you can see the level of detail that was able to be gained out from each of the individuals that shared their story. So this was an online mapping that occurred. However, sometimes we do things in person. This is what an in-person ripple effects mapping would have looked like. Where someone's standing in the center of the room, you can see that central idea again and the hierarchical coding or the hierarchical stories that come out from it. And the different colors in this case are different people that were sharing their stories. So I wanted to, as much as I find that participatory is exciting and important to do, I also want to recognize that there are challenges involved with it. Because I think that it would be short-sighted to sort of make the assumption that participatory is easy and everyone can do it and everyone should do it. So instead, I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of the challenges that I faced as an evaluator using ripple effects mapping as well as other participatory types of evaluation techniques. So it's a process. It's one that evaluators, researchers, stakeholders, and others would like to do, but don't necessarily always follow through with. And that's often for several specific reasons. One is that it's very time consuming. It's qualitative data, in essence, that's being gathered, at least in my experience, from ripple effects mapping. And that takes time. You have to gather people together. You have to set events up. That doesn't even get to when you are actually needing to do all the coding and data analysis, which is it takes a lot of time. It also can be expensive to execute. It is not inexpensive to get a group of people together and ask them a lot of questions and to engage with an evaluator multiple times over a sense of a project. And so kind of being aware of that and acknowledging that sometimes, yes, it is a lot less expensive to just put together a survey and send it out over Qualtrics and have people fill it out. That doesn't mean that you necessarily get the same kind of data, but you do need to recognize and understand that it can be expensive. And it's also very complex. If you're setting up a true participatory evaluation data project, it involves many pieces and it isn't necessarily the easiest thing. You have to make sure that you engage with people, that you have a level of trust, that you're not coming into a community and telling them what they should be collecting, but instead having engaged conversations. Sometimes stakeholders need to be convinced about why participatory is necessary and important. And a lot of times I've often gotten pushback from grant funders, clients, and academics about, well, why can't we just do a focus group, or why can't we just do a couple key informant interviews and send on the survey? And when you do that, it's very valuable information it's collected. I'm not denying that it isn't. However, it is also limiting in some ways. And so truly engaging in a participatory methodology allows participant voices to be heard throughout the entire portion of the data collection. And it's not just one piece, it's through the whole process. As part of this, there's also sometimes tensions that arrive between how a participatory project is designed and what those involved believe should be done. So you need to make sure that as you're engaged in participatory work, that you are engaging with various stakeholders, that you're not just talking to one or two people. And that also you need to be prepared possibly for pushback from even your own team members. I recently went through an experience where I hired someone to do a do some data analysis on a project. And this person felt very strongly about how that data, about what the focus of that data analysis should be. And the participants, on the other hand, had very clearly set forth what they wanted when it came to data collection and data analysis. And this pushed back so hard that they actually were walking away from the project because they felt so strongly that the wrong, quote unquote, wrong decisions were being made. However, as outside evaluators or outside data analysts or whatever it may be, it isn't our job to tell people or to tell participants or to tell communities what it is that they should be doing. Instead, we need to be open and engaged with them. I do want to end, however, on a more positive note. So before that idea of whose voice matters is very important. So keep that in mind and sort of remind yourself, are you listening to the correct people? Are the right people in the room? Are the people who, whether it's grant funders, stakeholders, clients, whoever it may be, ensure that everyone's voices are being told. Like I mentioned, though, I did want to end sort of on a higher note, and there's really a lovely case study in the chapter that highlights sort of how this process has worked in a very effective manner. The Eastside Community Health and Wellbeing Collaborative came together in the St. Paul, Minnesota, which is in the Midwest United States. And it was created to kind of address the social determinants of health and how those might affect individual level health outcomes. And it had been going on for several years, this collaborative, and it was a group of different members of partners throughout the community who were focused on health and well-being that came together to do work. And so the REM session that was done brought over 20 partners together to discuss, and these were the appreciative inquiry questions so that you get a sample of what those were. What's a highlight achievement or success you've had based on your involvement? What unexpected things have happened as a result of your involvement? And what connections with others, new and or deepened, have you made as a result? And what have those connections led to? So this ripple effects mapping session was a very positive event. The results of it were actually used by the collaborative in strategic planning to outline the next 3 years of their work. So they got information that was so valuable to them that they could actually make plans. One of the participants actually said, through the REM process, you see new partnerships formed, relationships deepened, and a true sense of collaborative work being practiced. It's exciting to see what can happen next in the ripples ahead. So this is just one example of a participatory technique, sort of the abstract, a little bit more specific, and then actually how it was applied in the community. So I hope that this was useful for you. I'll go ahead and post a couple resources in the chat box so that if you're interested in exploring it more, you can certainly do so. And you can feel free to reach out to me as well. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to Marina.
Excellent, thank you so much, Rebecca. So there's lots of questions in the chat of people wanting more details on certain steps. So we'll come back to those after we hear from Tom and pick up on some of the questions that help us have this broader conversation. But also just to note that ripple effects mapping includes within it lots of the elements that you can find in the other chapters as well. So things like opening up a process to look for unintended as well as intended change, the power of narratives and the stories in the process, as well as the visual element of identifying patterns and systems. So I'm going to hand over to Tom now to share some insights and wisdom in terms of how you see this fitting in kind of today's conversation, as we were saying earlier, this move towards more complexity-aware evaluation in general, and how do you think this kind of adds to that conversation?
Thanks, Marina. Wasn't sure quite where to start this actually, but I have three main areas that I thought were broadly relevant. One is essentially, when should we be doing this? The second is, how much of this can we realistically do? And the third is how you manage the politics of doing this. So that hopefully touches on some of the key points that both Will and Rebecca raised. Initially, I was going to start with the when, but actually I think from the conversation, I think the place to start actually is on sort of the optimism, pessimism slide. There was a book by a bunch of realist researchers which celebrated the success of realist evaluation a few years ago, and they were jubilant that they'd passed 20 plus years, and they sort of stood up and suggested that we've survived where others may fall by the wayside. And I think that kind of failed Will's point about humility, which I think is a really important place to start actually, insofar as that there are rarely the right methods. These are the right methods for the right circumstances, negotiated through a process with whichever program you're working with. So I think it's important to start with humility, actually. Nonetheless, I think it is worth paying attention to the fact that quite a lot of the methods, including those mentioned here, have been around for 20 plus years. So outcome mapping has recently celebrated 20 years. Most significant change similarly has 300 odd resources on its website, and albeit ripple effect mapping, for instance, is newer. It's been around for a bit now, and therefore it's a good moment to test sort of how it fits with the plans that we have. I think that's an important place to start, because we have to negotiate through various things in practice. I think that the positive angle on this is that I think there are some misperceptions that we need to debunk about whether or not participation is intrinsically a threat to rigor. It isn't. It is often perceived as such, and something that you just sprinkle in on top of hard quant data, which is like better data, which is nonsense. And I think how we conceive rigor is an important part of that conversation. I think what you actually find in practice, or certainly in my practice, is that actually participation can strengthen rigor in many respects, because it can enhance your collective reasoning, because you might be asking critical questions you might not otherwise ask. It can enhance credibility through triangulation. Very importantly, it can help make monitoring and evaluation more responsive to context and to communities, which is vital, particularly if we're looking at things like member checks, such as Rebecca just mentioned. And finally, it tells us to what degree certain things might or might not be transferable to different contexts. So whether or not you should replicate different things or adapt them to particular contexts. So I think that's, we need to collectively start debunking that myth. Nonetheless, we do have to negotiate this with the program themselves, and we have to check on what the real appetite is in the process. So I think it's really important to bear that in mind, particularly with newer methods that may be less familiar to people. When should we be doing this? I think one thing that comes out, and I think is evident in a number of the chapters in this section, is that we should be doing it in theory throughout the whole process of a program. Or at the very least, there are different moments within a program we should be considering including greater participation with a particular step. So you can have a more participatory theory of change process that can add to the critical thinking that you may have. As mentioned, you can have member checks. You can, I mean, Rebecca gave various examples I don't need to go over, I think, actually, but you can envisage particular moments where participation can potentially enhance the process, and I think raise the credibility of what you're trying to do. One other, I think, facilitating factor, which is important here, I think the pivot to learning, which I think is mentioned in the introductory chapter, is helpful to us here, insofar as that gives us an opportunity, I think, to raise some of these questions about whose reality counts, why that matters, and why multiple perspectives in particular can be helpful, and can actually aid adaptive management in particular, which is another buzzword of the day. How much of this can you realistically do? I think that's a really important practical question, which again depends on the context. We often in practice skip various steps in certain methods. So it's relatively common to skip particular steps in outcome mapping, for instance. I used to work for CARE, and we would typically skip the very first step around vision because it was difficult for us to respond to such an expansive vision when we could respond to a particular mission with a particular scope of work. It was a sort of a reality check on what we could contribute and what others would need to contribute to a process. And I think others tend to do the same thing. So you do make certain accommodations there. But I think one key part of it is about how you can make it fit into the process. And that comes back to what actually is the program that you have, what are its attributes, what questions do you have? And both of those ultimately lead what method or what aspects of a particular method I think that you should be considering. And I think there are many relevant methods in the section here that you can consider either individually or in combination. Often in combination adds to the strength of the overall approach. And I think the second thing here is back to Rebecca's point about narratives. I think one thing that, again, it speaks to humility as well, but one thing that we don't often recognize enough, I think, is how we bring our own values and norms into a particular process. So we need to continuously check ourselves on whose narrative it is that we're raising here and whether and when that particularly matters. It's not always vital that you have the perspective of all groups at all times, but particularly when you're making a claim about a particular context or a particular group or a particular community, it's quite important that you have that check and make sure that you're not imposing your values onto that community if you can possibly avoid it, because ultimately what you're trying to do is speak to their values and their context and their perceptions of what matters and what is significant to them, as much as what may be considered significant to you as a researcher or an evaluator or a program manager. And I thought I'd just stop there.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Tom. So lots in there to think more about in terms of, particularly how we fit methods together. Just to pick up on a few of the questions that have come through the chat, thanks everybody for engaging in the discussion in the chat, and come back, Rebecca, to you. So this point that Tom has raised around rigor, right, which links very often in the evaluation space to these questions around bias and the type of bias you have in a particular method. So there's a couple of questions in the chat there in terms of, in ripple effects mapping, how do you account for attribution bias in how participants recollect how and why the intervention caused a change, And I wondered if, building on that, if you could also comment a little bit on some of the questions around how does the actual analysis work? You talked about coding. If you could say a little bit more about that and the extent to which that is participatory as well.
Sure. So as far as bias, with any type of, any time we're collecting data as evaluators, there's going to be bias introduced. I mean, the people who are in the room as evaluators, we bring bias to the table. As far as attribution bias, what we have often found that because it is a collective data process, so people are actually speaking in front of others, whether it's online or in a particular room, they actually will call each other out if there's something that isn't an accurate reflection of what happened within the community. And I can give a particular example of this. We were doing a ripple effects mapping one time, and someone said that, well, when we created the community garden, and someone else stepped in and said, whoa, that wasn't us, that was Susan who did that. And so part of the facilitator's job at that point was to say, so specifically, it sounds as if Susan played an important role. What was this group's role in the garden? And so being able to quickly identify that what the group believed to have happened, what this individual believed to have happened, was actually called out to say that's actually not accurate. During the group reflection, that's not the only opportunity though. We also send the ripple effects map back to the stakeholders so they have an opportunity to look at it and to reflect on what was shared. And if there is a question, because we all do have different memories of how things happened, then we kind of discuss it as a collective. There are times when we've gotten together, and this kind of goes partly into the analysis portion, where we've gotten together with a smaller group of stakeholders to talk through the coding process. So coding for ripple effects mapping can be either inductive or deductive. Sometimes we go in with a very specific theory and we apply the data and the understanding the work that came out of it. We sort of apply that theory to understand the work better. Other times we're sort of doing that ground up approach where we're reading what is it that people spoke to and how does that help us better understand. And the stakeholders, and then sometimes it's actually a blend where we do both. And so we invite the stakeholders in during each part of the analysis. So we sort of start in the very beginning before we even start analyzing to check the data. And then when we do initial overall themes, very high level themes before we kind of start a hierarchical coding scheme, we check in and say, these are the initial themes we're seeing. Does this make sense to you? Is this what you're understanding as well? Or is this wildly out in left field? And it's a dialogue. It's a continuous dialogue. It's not a one and done at any time, simply because if you were to only ask once, then you could get, kind of off on the wrong path and not realize it until it was too late. So I hope that addresses some of the concerns that were brought up.
Great, thanks so much, Rebecca. No, I'm really interesting to hear the steps and the iterative process of sense making, right? And the way in which we can bring the analysis back and then open it up again. But I also really liked your comment about how people in the room check each other's stories and biases. And so illustrating that inherently in a participatory process, essentially you want people's direct experience. So you acknowledge that is biased, and that's the purpose of it. Just to pick up also on, there's lots of other comments in the chat. But this question around the different stakeholders involved, Will, that you mentioned to begin with, and Tom, you mentioned the need to think about how we create more space for these methods and how we deal with these questions around rigor and bias. And Rebecca, you mentioned that as well. Will, so coming to you, in terms of those different stakeholders, and in terms of, if you like, that principle of navigating the politics from your experience of many years of doing this kind of work, what do you think helps one to open up that space, to deepen the participatory practice within evaluations?
I think it's been covered well with the rigor is about asking people, and Tom put it really well. People will tell you what's right and what's wrong. You actually get richer data by asking people and putting it out there so that the nuances can come out. I think when we put up that first slide about those different groups, a lot of the work I do is increasingly a group of project staff wanting to understand how to do their project better, and so work better with the people that will be impacted by that program. And quite often we think of evaluation as coming in and just judging a program. And I think that's where it's coming in and saying, let's be pragmatic. We can only do so much, but let's really think about how we can do that. How can we be adaptive? And so for a lot of the work I do, the participation is actually very much with the program staff rather than necessarily people that are, the end and beneficiaries or disadvantaged people by different programs that come out. And I think it would be nice if funders sort of came in on that. There's a question there. Someone's said, how do you get funders and those people to buy in more? And I suppose it's that sort of thing. One would hope that they buy in, just like program staff are increasingly buying into how do we do our work and how can we be sure we're listening to people.
Great, thanks. Thanks for that, Will. And there's specifically also a question about, and I'd be interested, Tom, to hear your experience here of how do we actually open up space for the people out there whom programs are serving, if you like to use that language, can actually begin to enter the sort of invited space, as it usually is with evaluation, and take more ownership over it. And whether in your experience of different programs, you see us being able to branch out of the evaluation being the space in which we invite people in.
I think it's difficult because it goes back to 2 points that Rebecca made about the expense and sometimes the difficulty, actually. And I think I'd agree with Will that very often we're referring to participation, it's with a project team as much as it is often with communities themselves. I think we have to hold ourselves accountable to the fact that we're doing that, actually. And I think that's an important intermediate step, saying, well, how inclusive really was this? And the same is true in programming more generally, where it's just cheaper to access certain people. And that's the reason why we do it. let's be honest about it. But then recognizing that, it then allows you to think about, well, where and how can I get hold of resources to be able to do that in a more meaningful way, and at what point? Possibly not in every moment in a project, but at certain key moments where you need to make decisions and where a member check of some kind is important. Particularly, we often, when I was at CARE, we relied on unrestricted funding often, which we would lobby for internally in order to get that flexibility we needed so that we could bring people in more expressly. And I think that's something you have to really consider right from the beginning, but also to demonstrate how it and in what way it will add value. There are compelling reasons why this can add value, and it can add rigor, and it can improve decision making. But it's not always clear that that's the case to everyone. So you have to make the case for not only that this is a good thing to do intrinsically, it's valuable, it's a good thing to do, aren't we good people, but that it actually improves the process of decision making and can potentially lead to better results.
Great. Well, thank you very much to all of the panelists. We've only got a couple of minutes left. So I just wanted to pick up on something that's been mentioned in the chat, and I think implicitly was there in all the conversation we had, which is being aware of power, right, within any participatory process. So precisely understanding and asking the who question throughout, and you've all made that point, right, that it's about doing so throughout the process and starting with that question of what's it for, as Tom says, but also who is it for, right? And so that's one of the long-standing critiques of participatory methods, is that they're often applied in ways that are not power aware. And that goes back also to Will's point initially, which is it's about the evaluator themselves as well. So I think we're almost out of time. So I'll just turn, if there are any last thoughts, Rebecca, that you'd like to share, and then to Will, and I think we can probably call it a day.
Sure.
Rebecca.
I was trying to answer questions as quickly as I could in the chat, so I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to everyone, but I did want to mention, and I think that this was sort of assumed, there's so many different things swirling around, but a couple things I wanted to definitely highlight is that ripple effects mapping as a participatory technique, as well as others, is one tool in your toolbox. To truly avoid bias and to get the voice of everyone, you need to use multiple methods. And so don't just focus on one and assume that that's going to get you all the answers to everything you need when it comes to evaluation. That would certainly be rather inaccurate. The other thing about participatory that is very important, and I've seen this word come up, is the idea of power. And so ensure that what I appreciate about participatory the most is that it really puts the power and the voice back in the hands of the participants, believing that they know their own story the best, and allowing them to tell it is what's most important. Thank you
So much, Rebecca. So Will, closing remarks, and perhaps also what are the thoughts on how we share this information beyond the SAGE handbook? So I see you put that link in, but over to you, Will, to close us off. Oh, you're muted.
Okay, now I've just put a link up to a blog I just wrote last week, but that's got some guides, some open access guides that are there available around other methods in the chapters, including Rebecca's. Well, we'd be quite keen on people giving ideas about where we go. So at the moment, we're thinking of taking this a bit further through the Participatory Methods website at IDS, is it, Marina? And also my own website, Learning for Sustainability. So we're just looking for places that are more accessible to carry on that discussion, particularly on participation that the panelists have talked to and has come up through the questions as being key. How do we do that participatory analysis? How do we become pragmatic about doing it?
Brilliant. Well, we're at time. So thank you so much, Tom. Thanks, Rebecca and Will, for being with us. And yeah, please, everybody, apologies we couldn't get to all the brilliant questions and comments in the chat, but please do get in touch. with the authors of the chapters. Authors are allowed to share versions of their chapters for research use. So if you get in touch with them directly, they'll be able to. And yeah, look forward to seeing how the conversation evolves. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.